Tonight, global flashpoints ignite. The Gaza ceasefire on shaky ground, with Israel demanding the return of every deceased hostage. Plus, Ukrainian President Zelensky heads to Washington as the war with Russia escalates. And new tensions brew between the United States and Venezuela. Expert analysis to help break down what it all means for the world stage. Plus, faith under fire. Chinese church leaders arrested in a sweeping crackdown, with the White House calling for their release. And from spiritual landmark to cultural powerhouse, how a historic church in the nation's capital is making a comeback and inspiring a new generation.
To be able to inherit, to honor that history, but also give it new vision, new life.
All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. Stop the bloodshed or else. The president warning tonight we will have no choice but to go in and kill Hamas after days of public executions in Gaza. Good evening from the CBN News Bureau in Washington, D.C. I'm John Jessup. Well, Mr. Trump that warning is coupled with disappointment tonight for Israeli families as Hamas fails to deliver on a key component of the peace agreement. As of Thursday, only 9 of the 28 missing hostage remains have been turned over to Israeli officials. Hamas now saying they have recovered all the remains they could find, but that falls short of the original deal. It called for the return of all hostages, living and deceased, within 72 hours. The admission could throw a wrench into the already fragile peace agreement. The United States is providing intelligence and logistical support to locate the remaining bodies, although President Trump stressed returning all living hostages was key to the deal. Well, this is just one of a number of international conflicts in which the United States is intervening and taking the lead. CBN national security correspondent Caitlin Burke joins us now. Caitlin, let's stick with Israel. How likely is it that fighting could resume if Hamas doesn't follow through on returning all of the hostage remains?
Well, John, it's unclear. President Trump doesn't believe it will come to that, although he says he would consider allowing Israel to resume military action if Hamas doesn't hold up its end of the ceasefire deal, including the return of all deceased hostages. Hamas says special equipment and significant effort will be required to return the remaining 19 bodies.
They're actually digging. There are areas where they're digging and they're finding a lot of bodies. Then they have to separate the bodies. You wouldn't believe this. And some of those bodies have been in there a long time.
Israel says it will not compromise on this point in the ceasefire deal. Meanwhile, the Trump administration intervening closer to home as well, the president confirming he's authorized covert CIA action inside Venezuela and is also considering strikes on land targets. All this part of the administration's efforts to cut down on drug smuggling and violent crime.
I think Venezuela is feeling heat, but I think a lot of other countries are feeling heat too. We're not going to let this country, our country, be ruined because other people want to drop, as you say, their worst. They have given us their worst.
Earlier this week, the U.S. blew up a boat believed to be smuggling drugs off the coast. It's the 5th such attack in recent weeks, killing 27 people. Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro denouncing Trump and calling on the international community to intervene. Here in Washington, the president now switching gears as he prepares for a Friday meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at the White House.
We'll be talking about the war with him, and we'll be talking about, I mean, they want to go offensive. I'll make a determination on that, but they would like to go offensive, you know that, and we'll have to make a determination.
Trump has been considering providing Ukraine with American-made Tomahawk missiles, which could allow for strikes deep into Russia. Speaking from a meeting Wednesday with other NATO allies, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said firepower is coming to Ukraine through European nations' purchases of U.S. weapons. It remains to be seen whether that includes Tomahawks. Ukraine is also seeking cruise missiles, air defense systems, and a joint drone production agreement from the U.S. President Trump reiterating Wednesday he's ready to do what it takes to end this war.
I thought we had a deal 2 months ago. Who would think I created peace in the Middle East and can't get the two guys to settle? But I think we'll get them.
Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin did speak on the phone today. In a Truth Social post, President Trump said great progress was made on the call, and the two leaders agreed to have high-level advisors meet next week. That initial meeting will be followed by another in-person summit between Trump and Putin. John?
All right, CBN National Security Correspondent Caitlin Burke. Thank you so much, Caitlin. Well, Michael Hanlon joins us now to help us better understand the day's events. He is a senior fellow and director of research and foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. Michael, welcome back. Let's stick with the Middle East first. Hamas says it has returned all the remains that it could recover. How credible is that claim, and what does that mean for the durability of this ceasefire?
Greetings. Well, first of all, I never trust anything Hamas says, so that's point one. But second, as the President of the United States alluded to a few minutes ago on your show with the clip that you played, it's hard to know exactly what kind of condition some of these remains would be in after potentially up to 2 years of decay. And also, of course, bombing in a number of the locations where people were located. So I don't necessarily assume all the remains can be found or recognized anyway. You may have to do very substantial forensic analysis just to know who might have been there. And so I think the key answer here is to find some way of doing further investigation, not trusting Hamas, but also not really distrusting them, because again, it's very hard in this kind of a war zone to keep track of bodies without electricity, without refrigeration, without who knows other means of preserving their remains over a period of months or years.
Yeah, it does seem very difficult, and as you said, would require forensic analysis. Also difficult, maybe this question to answer: if Israel does conclude that Hamas is intentionally withholding bodies, or if those public executions continue, how likely do you think it is that the fighting could resume, and what would that mean for the United States' role in enforcing this fragile peace deal?
I think the chances of fighting resuming would be very high. And I think, I don't know how to quantify the number, but it's certainly going to be, 25, 50, 75%. I mean, a lot more than single digits. As for what the United States can do, I like the fact that President Trump is willing to use American leverage and be tough with both parties here, including an Israeli prime minister. But I don't think that we call the shots. And I think we have to be careful to avoid talking ourselves into that. Let's bear in mind, yes, President Trump brought some good diplomacy and some good tools to this, but Israel had already destroyed much of Hezbollah, much or most of Hamas, much of Iran's nuclear program with our help, and reshaped the broader Middle East. And only then was Netanyahu prepared to negotiate a ceasefire, in addition to the short-lived one that happened earlier. So I could easily imagine this one ending fairly quickly as well. We're nowhere near the finish line.
Speaking of being nowhere near the finish line, I want to turn to Ukraine, which suffered heavy bombardment of drone and missile strikes overnight targeting their infrastructure, energy infrastructure. Zelensky is getting ready to head to the United States, and he's going to push for Tomahawk missiles. Can you talk about what's at stake in this visit and how far President Trump might be willing to go?
I think there's a decent chance that President Trump will provide the Tomahawks. Again, you played the clip that had those words come out of his own mouth that he's contemplating and assessing. I think it's a close call. On the one hand, Ukraine can already strike into Russia, but it does so with drones that have small warheads and relatively slow speed. Tomahawk has greater speed, greater range, greater payload, the ability to maybe take down for longer periods of time electricity production facilities or major oil facilities. Maybe even military leadership or political leadership inside of Russia. And so for that reason, Putin's going to be very, very upset about this idea, but doesn't mean Putin gets a veto, obviously. He's more than willing to use missile strikes against Ukraine, to say the least. And so maybe the way to use this leverage is to try to at least get Putin to stop shooting his own big missiles at Ukrainian cities. I doubt he would. But if President Trump can make the threat credible enough, maybe we can back this thing down on both sides. My guess, though, is that it's going to be a close call because Trump is going to be worried about offending Putin, a guy who he still wants to try to do a deal with, and also risking Russian escalation against NATO territory in the aftermath of these various Russian drones that have already shown up over NATO airspace.
All right, Michael Hanlon with the Brookings Institution. We always appreciate your time. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you kindly.
Well, here in Washington, the Senate tried and failed for the 10th time to pass a resolution that could reopen the government. The measure fell short of the 60 votes needed to advance as the country stares down the 16th day of the shutdown. Meanwhile, a federal judge halted the Trump administration's attempt to use the government closing to fire some 4,000 federal employees. The judge calling the firings, quote, politically motivated and unprecedented. Well, in Chicago, the court's stepping into the standoff between federal law enforcement and protesters. A federal judge now requiring all ICE officers to wear body cameras in the middle of President Trump's immigration crackdown. District Judge Sarah Ellis says she was startled by footage of clashes with protesters. Last week, she banned riot control tactics against peaceful demonstrators and required visible badges. The Justice Department says the media footage is misleading and cameras can't be immediately deployed. Dozens of arrests and heightened tensions. A look at China's latest crackdown on Christianity when Faith Nation returns. Welcome back. Fear is sweeping through churches in China as government officials heighten their crackdown on Christianity. The United States government now demanding the release of some 30 leaders from underground churches after a string of weekend arrests. The persecution is nothing new with the Chinese Communist Party's ban on unauthorized or non-sanctioned churches. Secretary of State Marco Rubio slammed the arrests, calling it another example of China's Christian hostility. The latest string of arrests come as tensions over trade grow between the United States and China. Well, for more, we now have Olivia Enos. She's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Olivia, thank you for making time to be with us. As noted, China's surveillance, its regulation and crackdown on churches is not new. But what prompted this round of arrests? Why now?
That's a great question. As we know, this is the largest crackdown on a single unregistered house church in China in over 40 years. As you mentioned, Pastor Ezra Jin, along with 30 other pastors and associates of Zion Church, one of the largest churches throughout China, they have all been detained or disappeared. This is really something that we have to watch. And as you mentioned earlier, this is not happening in a vacuum. This is happening amidst an ongoing trade war between the US and China. We just saw China acting out by saying we're going to put an export ban on rare earth minerals, something that they walked back after President Trump said this is unacceptable. But in the midst of all of those ongoing negotiations, President Trump also mentioned that the anticipated meeting that's coming up in South Korea amidst APEC between President Trump and Xi Jinping, that this could actually be called off over the rare earth minerals dispute that the CCP has sparked. All of this happened within days. Pastor Jin and other folks at Zion Church were arrested. And so I think we have to keep all of that in mind. And if I were President Trump, I would condition my future meeting with Xi on the sidelines of APEC on the release of Pastor Jin and other high priority political prisoners like him.
You know, you moderated a discussion about the Chinese Communist Party back at the Hudson Institute in September, calling on the United States to do more to secure the release of nearly 2 million Uyghurs, in addition to 1,000 political prisoners in Hong Kong, as well as Tibetans and Christians currently being detained. Why does the Chinese government view these groups with such suspicion and hostility?
Well, the Chinese Communist Party views anyone who respects and honors an authority above the party as a threat to the party's power. So the CCP has undertaken policies of sinicization, which is simply a fancy word of saying we're going to try to secularize all religion so that any sort of religious practice is subservient to the goals and aims of the Chinese Communist Party. But the CCP goes beyond just this sort of secularization of religion and extends it to say any person who is religious is extremist and a threat. And so they use these faulty justifications as a reason for why they can engage in crackdowns like the one that they're carrying out against Pastor Jin, or the one that they are carrying out against the Uyghur people, which, as you mentioned, there were at one point at least 1.8 million Uyghurs held in political re-education camps. And I think the most essential thing to bear in mind is that If the CCP views human rights violations as an essential tool to maintaining their grip on power, the US government needs to have a robust defense of human rights and a robust apparatus to press for the release of political prisoners and to safeguard and defend religious freedom and other freedoms of folks across China facing persecution and the ire of the CCP.
Yeah, and you did mention that President Trump should stress that on a sideline conversation with Xi at the APEC meeting at the end of the month. We just have a minute left, but I want to ask you, according to International Christian Concern, it puts the number of Chinese Christians between 85 to 128 million people. Can you remind our viewers of what it's like for Christians in China, why so many have joined the underground church rather than a state-sanctioned or state-sponsored church?
Yes, I think that, a Christian recognizes that if their faith has to be subservient to a government, it isn't really practicing faith. And so the reason why you have so many unregistered churches is because people want to be able to worship God. They want to be able to worship Jesus Christ and to recognize that he is seated on the throne, not Xi Jinping. And so you have so many unregistered churches and incredibly brave individuals like Ezra Jin, who were willing to speak out, were willing to share the gospel, were willing to create a safe space for Christians. In fact, his weekly prayer meetings attracted over 10,000 individuals every single week. So we need to be joining in prayer for those individuals who are likely to face more persecution.
Right.
I suspect this is only the beginning.
Well, very important. We're grateful that you're here to help highlight the issue. Olivia Enos with the Hudson Institute, thank you so much for being with us this evening. Where art and worship collide, we give you an inside look at a D.C. church restoring beauty and culture to a forgotten treasure. Next. Welcome back. After years of being left abandoned, a rundown church built in the 1800s right here in the nation's capital has a new lease on life. CBN's Michelle London shows us how its new church owners are reimagining this age-old space for future generations.
For more than a century, this building served as a church. Then, like most neglected D.C. properties, it fell into disrepair. In 2002, visionaries purchased the building, turning it into an art venue. Now, Pastor Mark Batterson says he plans to blend and preserve its legacy with a new season of creativity and culture.
A space for praise and worship in one room, and to enjoy art in the next. Walls that hold decades of prayers also showcase the work of local D.C. creatives, like National Community Church artist-in-residence Benjamin Baum.
When people interact with the painting, their mind immediately goes to a verse in the gospel. And I think that embodies what I want to do with most of my artwork.
And why is this needed in today's time for your generation?
When we look back on people who have done so much for us, we tend to forget that the reason why we have these amazing pieces of art, the reason why we have cultural giants today, is because somebody took a step that was dangerous and vulnerable for their well-being.
A D.C. cultural giant showcased here in Baum's painting is Robert Laws, a formerly enslaved man who took that dangerous leap of faith back in the 1800s.
Born on a plantation in Virginia, 1837, 1863, escapes on foot, walks all the way to Washington, D.C.
Pastor Mark Batterson points to the archives, which show Laws and his wife Patsy held their first church gathering back in 1875. Under his guidance, the original building would be constructed 11 years later by one of the city's oldest Black congregations.
From 1886 all the way through urban renewal in the 50s, the revivals that would have happened in the 20s and 30s.
Over the years, the church, known as Friendship Baptist, endured adversity. After 3 congregations, the building was abandoned for nearly 20 years. Now, Pastor Mark and NCC are stepping up with a vision for the landmark.
The history of the church is a relay race, and we take the baton from the last generation, we hand it to the next generation. And so we really view ourselves simply as stewards.
From one generation to the next, these men agree that NCC is the ideal place to advance Culture House's new vision.
I'm really grateful to NCC, not only for adopting this vision, but holding the history in place and not tearing it down, but building something on top of a solid foundation.
They've done an outstanding job of memorializing the history of the building, because the history, in fact, dictates things for the future.
D.C. native Donald Isaac developed a special connection with Friendship Baptist over the years. He's excited to see what Culture House will become.
Seldom do you see the pastor's name being broadcast. They do it not for individual glory, not for their congregational glory, but for the glory of God and for the building of the kingdom.
It's not about the name over the church door, it's about the name above all names. And so I think a lot of churches, a lot of groups will use this space.
A space that provides a gathering place and ministry outreach for the local community while celebrating the arts. But above all, Pastor Mark hopes Culture House will unleash gifts within the church.
To be able to inherit, to honor that history, but also give it new vision, new life, not just as an art gallery, an event venue, but a place where we worship once again is pretty special.
The Culture House's transformation over the years reflects Scripture. Isaiah 58:12 reads, "Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings." Pastor Mark says the time for revival in the nation's capital is here and now. Michelle London, CBN News, Washington.
Beautiful story. Thank you, Michelle. Well, a heartwarming moment on the sidelines at Sunday's Indianapolis Colts game. That's next on Faith Nation. Well, finally tonight, a young Indianapolis Colts fan received a special surprise on the sidelines at Sunday's game. 8-year-old Mark Braster was invited onto the field to see his favorite players up close and personal at his very first NFL game. You can see him there. Mark, who was born deaf and has a rare brain disorder, was approached by a Colts cheerleader who stopped to say hello. His mom explained that Mark just started at the Indiana School for the Deaf. That's when Morgan began signing to him, a moment that's since gone viral.
It's your first time? You give me so much fun. Yeah? He gets excited when he sees other people signing. Yeah, it's so much fun.
Mark's mother says she hopes the moment shows people the importance of inclusion to kids like Mark and others like him. A beautiful moment there. Well, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you back here tomorrow.